The will reading should have been Dustin's coronation, the moment he'd inherit his mother's $34 million empire and finally prove his worthless father meant nothing. But when the lawyer's voice cut through the silence with those devastating words, Jerry Flores inherits controlling interest, Dustin's world didn't just crack, it shattered completely. What happened next would expose family secrets that had been buried for decades. Welcome to a story that will keep you on the edge of your seat until the very last word. Before we dive in, please comment below with your city so I can see how far this incredible tale has traveled around the world. Now let me take you inside the most shocking inheritance battle you've ever heard. I never thought I'd be sitting in a mahogany-paneled law office at 52, my calloused hands fidgeting with a funeral program that still smelled like lilies and regret. The uncomfortable leather chair seemed to mock every choice I'd made in the past 15 years. Every night shift at the power plant. Every lonely dinner in my cramped apartment, every time I'd convince myself that Brianna Chen Flores was better off without me. But here I was 3 days after burying my ex-wife, surrounded by the suffocating weight of old money and older grudges. "Dad, what are you even doing here?" Dustin's voice sliced through my thoughts like a rusty blade. My 30-year-old son sat across from me, his $1,000 suit perfectly pressed, his dark hair slicked back in that arrogant style he'd adopted sometime after business school. Everything about him screamed success, from his platinum watch to his Italian leather shoes. Everything except his eyes, which held the same cold calculation I'd seen in his mother during our worst fights. "Your mother invited everyone mentioned in the will," I said quietly, not looking up from the program. Brianna's photo stared back at me, beautiful, fierce, untouchable. Even at 48, she'd been stunning. The cancer had taken her quickly, but it hadn't dimmed that fire in her eyes, the same fire that had first drawn me to her 23 years ago. "Invited?" Dustin laughed, and the sound echoed off the wood-paneled walls. "Dad, let's be honest here. Mom probably left you her collection of old coffee mugs, and maybe enough for a decent dinner. This is a courtesy, a formality." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to that patronizing tone he'd perfected over the years. "The real business happens after you leave." I felt my jaw tighten, but I kept my mouth shut. What was the point in arguing? Dustin was probably right. Brianna and I had barely spoken since the divorce papers were signed 15 years ago. Our conversations had been limited to awkward exchanges at Dustin's college graduation, his business school ceremony, and the occasional holiday gathering where we'd maintain a polite distance while our son worked the room like the networking prodigy he'd become. The law office of Morrison, Blackwell and Associates felt like a mausoleum, all dark wood and heavy silence, with the kind of pretentious atmosphere that made working-class guys like me feel like intruders. The walls were lined with legal tomes and photographs of distinguished partners shaking hands with politicians and celebrities. This was Brianna's world, now had been for years. Corporate law, high-stakes negotiations, million-dollar deals that I couldn't even pronounce, let alone understand. "Mr. Flores?" "Both Mr. Floreses." The receptionist's voice was professionally cheerful. "Mr. Morrison is ready for you now." Dustin stood first, adjusting his tie with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned their place in the world. I followed more slowly, my work boots silent on the plush carpet. The hallway was lined with portraits of the firm's founding partners, stern men in dark suits who seemed to judge everyone who passed beneath their painted gazes. Richard Morrison's corner office was even more intimidating than the waiting room. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of downtown's financial district, where glass towers stretched toward a gray February sky. Morrison himself was exactly what you'd expect from Brianna's lawyer, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, with the kind of authoritative presence that came from decades of handling other people's money. "Gentlemen, please take a seat." Morrison gestured to 2 chairs positioned in front of his massive desk. The surface was nearly bare except for a thick manila envelope, a small wooden box, and what looked like a personal letter sealed in cream-colored stationery. I settled into my chair, trying not to think about how out of place I looked in my only good suit, a navy blue number I'd bought 5 years ago for job interviews that never led anywhere better than the power plant. Dustin, meanwhile, looked like he belonged in a boardroom. Hell, he practically ran one. His position as vice president of strategic development at Chen Industries, the company Brianna had built from nothing, had made him wealthy in his own right. This inheritance would just be the crown on an already impressive kingdom. Before we begin, Morrison said, opening the manila envelope with practiced precision, I want to express my personal condolences. Brianna was not just a client, but a friend. Her loss is felt deeply by everyone who knew her. Thank you, Dustin said smoothly. Mom spoke of you often. She trusted your judgment completely. I just nodded, not trusting my voice. The truth was, I'd been a wreck since getting the call about Brianna's death. 3 days of sleepless nights of memories flooding back unbidden, the way she used to laugh at my terrible jokes, how she'd curl up against me on Sunday mornings, the dreams we'd shared before ambition and pride tore us apart. Morrison pulled out several documents, each one thick with legal language and official seals. Brianna's estate is substantial, as you both know. The total value, including all business holdings, real estate investments, and liquid assets, comes to approximately $34 million. Even though I'd expected it, the number still hit me like a punch to the gut. 34 million. When Brianna and I had gotten married, we'd been living paycheck to paycheck. I'd been working at the power plant for 3 years, making decent money, but nothing spectacular. She'd just finished law school and was struggling to find her footing at a small firm. We'd honeymoon in a roadside motel because it was all we could afford, and we'd been happy. God help me, we'd been so happy. The estate is complex, Morrison continued, with multiple components. There are the business holdings Chen Industries with its various subsidiaries and partnerships. There's the real estate portfolio, including the family home, the vacation property in Aspen, and several investment properties. There are also significant stock holdings bonds and other financial instruments. Dustin leaned forward slightly, his eyes bright with anticipation. This was his moment, the culmination of everything he'd worked toward. He'd been groomed for this since college, shaped and molded by his mother to take over the empire she'd built. Every business decision, every strategic move, every networking event had been preparation for this day. I found myself studying my son's face, looking for traces of the boy who used to build elaborate Lego cities on our kitchen table, who'd insisted I read him the same bedtime story 3 times in a row. When had he become this stranger? When had his mother's ambition become his armor? Now, let's begin with the specific bequests, Morrison said, adjusting his reading glasses. To my beloved son Dustin Chen Flores, I leave the family home at 1247 Maple Ridge Drive, valued at approximately $1.2 million, along with all its contents. Dustin nodded, unsurprised. The house was beautiful, a sprawling colonial in the city's most exclusive neighborhood, with manicured gardens and a 3-car garage that housed Brianna's collection of luxury vehicles. It was the kind of place I'd driven past as a kid, never imagining I'd ever step foot inside, let alone live there for 7 years of my life. I also leave to Dustin the sum of $500,000 in liquid assets to be transferred immediately upon the reading of this will. $500,000. I tried to wrap my mind around it. That was more money than I'd made in the last 10 years combined. But I could see from Dustin's expression that he'd expected more, much more. His jaw was tight, his fingers drumming impatiently on the arm of his chair. Morrison paused, glancing between us. The remainder of the estate presents a more, complex situation. Something in his tone made my stomach drop. There was a weight to his words, a gravity that suggested whatever came next would change everything. Brianna was very specific about her intentions regarding the business holdings and the bulk of her financial assets. Morrison's voice was measured professional, but I caught something else underneath surprise, maybe even concern. She wanted to ensure that her final wishes were carried out exactly as she envisioned, regardless of how others might react. Dustin shifted in his chair. Mr. Morrison, if you're trying to prepare me for some kind of charity donation or something, it's fine. Mom always talked about giving back. Just get to the point. Morrison looked at him for a long moment, then turned his attention to me. Jerry, I have to ask, when was the last time you spoke with Brianna? I mean, really spoke with her. The question caught me off guard. We didn't talk much. Maybe at Dustin's birthday dinner last year. Even then, it was just pleasantries. Why? Because what I'm about to read is going to come as a shock to both of you, but particularly to you, Jerry. Brianna made some very deliberate choices, and she wanted me to make sure you understood that these decisions were made with complete mental clarity and after extensive consideration. My heart started pounding. I don't understand. What does this have to do with me? Morrison picked up the main document, his eyes scanning the page. To my former husband, Jerry Flores, I leave controlling interest in Chen Industries, including all subsidiaries, partnerships, and related business entities. This represents approximately 65% ownership of all business operations. The words hit the room like a bomb. Dustin went absolutely still, his face draining of color. What did you just say? I also leave to Jerry Flores. Morrison continued, his voice steady, despite the tension crackling through the air. The sum of $33.5 million in combined assets, including the Aspen property, all investment portfolios, and the remaining liquid assets. The silence that followed was deafening. I felt like I was falling, like the chair had disappeared beneath me, and I was tumbling through empty space. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of mistake, some clerical error that would be corrected with embarrassed laughter and proper paperwork. That's impossible. Dustin's voice was barely a whisper. That's absolutely impossible. There has to be some mistake. My mother would never, she wouldn't. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This is fraud. This has to be fraud. Morrison remained calm, clearly accustomed to dramatic reactions. I assure you, Dustin, there's no fraud involved. Your mother came to me 8 months ago to revise her will. She was of completely sound mind, and I have medical documentation to support that if needed. She knew exactly what she was doing. 8 months ago. Dustin's voice was rising. She was already sick 8 months ago. The cancer was affecting her judgment. She couldn't have been thinking clearly. The cancer diagnosis came later, Morrison said firmly. And even after the diagnosis, she reconfirmed these instructions on multiple occasions. Brianna was one of the sharpest legal minds I've ever encountered. Trust me, she knew the implications of every word in this document. I finally found my voice. I don't understand. Why would she? We've barely spoken in 15 years. I don't know anything about running a business. I work at a power plant, for God's sake. Morrison reached for the sealed letter. She anticipated your confusion. She left this for you, Jerry. She asked me to read it aloud in both your presences. Dustin sank back into his chair, his face a mask of shock and betrayal. This is insane, completely insane. Dad doesn't know the first thing about Chen Industries. He'll run it into the ground within a year. Maybe you should listen to what your mother had to say before you write me off completely, I said, surprised by the edge in my own voice. Morrison carefully opened the envelope, unfolding several pages of Brianna's distinctive handwriting. Even from across the desk, I recognized those precise, flowing letters that had once written love notes and grocery lists in equal measure. Jerry. Morrison began reading Brianna's words. If you're hearing this, then I'm gone, and you're probably sitting in Richard's office wondering if the world has gone completely mad. I don't blame you. What I've done probably seems impossible to understand, but I need you to listen to everything I have to say. Her voice seemed to fill the room through Morrison's careful reading, and I felt tears threatening for the first time since the funeral. I've spent the last 15 years building something I thought would make me happy. I created an empire, accumulated wealth beyond our wildest dreams, and convinced myself that success would fill the hole that losing you had left in my life. But success is cold comfort. When you're lying in a hospital bed at 3 a.m, realizing that all the money in the world can't buy back the love you threw away. Dustin made a sound half-sob, half-protest. She's not thinking clearly. The medication, the stress. Let him finish, I said quietly. Morrison continued. I know you're probably thinking this is some kind of guilt-driven gesture, a deathbed attempt to make amends for the past. Maybe it is partly. But it's also something else. It's me finally admitting that you were right about what matters in life, and I was wrong. The words hit me like physical blows. Brianna had been so fierce in her conviction, so certain that ambition and success were the only paths to happiness. To hear her questioning everything we'd fought about. Dustin, my darling son, I know you're hurt and confused. I know you expected to inherit everything, and you have every right to feel betrayed. But the truth is, you're not ready for this kind of responsibility. Not yet. Maybe not ever, if you don't learn some fundamental truths about life that your father understood. And I forgot. Dustin's hands were clenched into fists. What truths? What could he possibly know that I don't? I have an MBA from Wharton. I've been running strategic development for 3 years. I've increased company profits by 40%. But Morrison kept reading. You see wealth as an end goal, Dustin. You've become everything I trained you to be, ambitious, driven, focused on success above all else. But in doing that, I failed to teach you what your father never forgot, that money is just a tool, not a destination. That treating people with dignity matters more than quarterly profits. That integrity isn't something you can put on a balance sheet. I remembered those fights now, the bitter arguments that had ultimately destroyed our marriage. Brianna pushing for more, always more bigger houses, newer cars, exclusive schools for Dustin. Me trying to hold on to the values my parents had taught me, the belief that family and community mattered more than bank account balances. Jerry worked at that power plant for over 20 years, and do you know what his coworkers called him? They called him Saint Jerry because he was the guy who covered shifts when someone's kid was sick, who organized collections for families going through hard times, who never complained even when management made decisions that screwed over the workers. He understood something. I lost sight of that how you treat people when you have power over them is the true measure of your character. The room was completely silent now except for Morrison's steady voice and the sound of Dustin's increasingly ragged breathing. I've watched you these past few years, son. I've seen how you talk to the support staff at the office, how you treat servers in restaurants, how you dismiss anyone you consider beneath your station. You've learned all my worst qualities and none of Jerry's best ones. This money would only make those tendencies worse. That's not fair, Dustin whispered. That's not fair. I've worked for everything I have. I've earned it. Morrison glanced at him sympathetically, but continued reading. This isn't punishment, Dustin. It's an opportunity. You have a house worth more than most people will see in a lifetime and enough money to start fresh to build something meaningful on your own terms. Maybe losing the inheritance you expected will teach you the value of earning something through character rather than birthright. I felt like I was drowning. This was all too much, too overwhelming. $33.5 million, a business empire, responsibilities I couldn't even begin to comprehend. And Jerry, Morrison continued, I know you're panicking right now. You're thinking about all the ways you'll fail, all the people who will suffer if you make the wrong decisions. But here's what I learned too late. You never failed at anything that really mattered. You were a good husband until I made it impossible for you to be. You've been a good father, despite all the obstacles Dustin and I put in your way. You've been a good friend, a good neighbor, a good man. The tears were coming now, despite my efforts to hold them back. 15 years of feeling like a failure, of believing that my inability to keep up with Brianna's ambitions had made me worthless, and here she was telling me I'd been right all along. The business will survive your learning curve. Richard has excellent recommendations for management consultants and advisors. The important thing is that Chen Industries will be run by someone who cares about more than just profit margins. Someone who remembers that behind every business decision are real people with real lives. Morrison paused, looking up at both of us. There's more. Dustin laughed bitterly. More? What else could there possibly be? Jerry, I need you to know that letting you go was the biggest mistake of my life. I convinced myself that you were holding me back, that your contentment with a simple life was somehow a character flaw. I was wrong. You weren't holding me back, you were keeping me grounded. You were reminding me what actually matters. I closed my eyes, overwhelmed by the weight of regret and lost time. I spent 15 years trying to prove I didn't need you building walls out of pride and ambition. But late at night, when the meetings were over and the deals were done, I was just a lonely woman who missed the man who used to make her laugh, who used to hold her when she was scared, who knew how to find joy in small things. Mom, Dustin whispered, and for a moment he sounded like the little boy he used to be. The cancer diagnosis was a wake-up call. Suddenly, all those business achievements felt meaningless. What good is being the most successful woman in the city if you die alone surrounded by legal documents instead of love? I wanted to reach out to you, Jerry, but I was too proud, too afraid you'd reject me after all these years of silence. Morrison's voice grew softer as he read the final paragraphs. So I'm doing the only thing I can do now. I'm giving you the power to build something better than what I created. Use this money to take care of people. Use the business to make a positive difference. Show our son what real success looks like. The letter concluded with words that shattered what was left of my composure. I never stopped loving you, Jerry. I just forgot how to show it. I hope you can forgive me. I hope you can forgive us both. The silence that followed was profound and terrible. Morrison carefully refolded the letter and placed it back in its envelope, then handed it to me with the solemnity of a funeral director passing over ashes. Dustin was staring at the floor, his shoulders shaking with what might have been laughter or sobs. She never stopped loving him, he said finally. 15 years of telling me what a disappointment he was, 15 years of building this company to show the world we didn't need him, and she never stopped loving him. I wanted to say something to offer some comfort, but what words could possibly address this level of betrayal and revelation? There are some additional provisions, Morrison said gently. Brianna established a trust fund for any future grandchildren, and there are specific charitable donations she wanted to make. But the bulk of the estate transfers as I've described. Dustin stood up slowly, moving like a man in a dream. I need to go. I can't be here right now. Son, I started, but he held up a hand to stop me. Don't. Just don't. Not right now. He looked at Morrison. I assume there will be paperwork to contest this. Morrison nodded gravely. Of course. Though I should tell you, Brianna anticipated that possibility. She was very thorough in documenting her mental state and her reasoning. Any legal challenge would be expensive and likely unsuccessful. We'll see about that. Dustin headed for the door, then turned back one last time. You know what the really crazy part is, Dad? Part of me always wondered if she still cared about you. The way she'd get quiet when your name came up, how she never dated anyone seriously after the divorce. I used to hope when I was younger that maybe you two would figure it out. He left without another word, the door clicking shut behind him, with a finality that seemed to echo through my bones. Morrison and I sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, he cleared his throat. This is a lot to process, Jerry. You don't have to make any decisions today about how to handle the business operations. I stared down at the letter in my hands, Brianna's final words to me. She really thought this through. For months. She consulted with psychologists, business advisors, even had a priest come talk to her about the ethics of dramatic wealth redistribution. This wasn't an impulsive decision born of illness or medication. This was Brianna at her most calculating and deliberate. But why? Why hurt Dustin like this? Whatever problems she had with him, he's still her son. Morrison considered his words carefully. I think she believed that inheriting everything would ultimately destroy him. She saw what wealth without wisdom had done to her, how it had cost her the love of her life and turned her into someone she barely recognized. Maybe she thought giving Dustin a smaller inheritance would force him to develop the character she felt he was lacking. I thought about my son, brilliant, ambitious, successful, but somehow hollow in a way that had always worried me. Had Brianna seen something I'd been afraid to acknowledge? What happens now? I asked. Now you have some very big decisions to make. The business can largely run itself in the short term. Brianna built an excellent management team, but long-term strategic decisions will need your input. And the financial assets, well, they'll require careful management. $33.5 million. The number still seemed impossible, like a figure from someone else's life entirely. I don't know anything about running a company, I said. But you know about leading people, Morrison replied. And according to Brianna, that's what the company needs most. I stood to leave my legs unsteady beneath me. Everything I thought I knew about my life, about my worth, about my relationship with Brianna and Dustin had been turned upside down in the span of an hour. Jerry, Morrison called as I reached the door. For what it's worth, I think she made the right choice. I've seen a lot of wealthy families destroy themselves fighting over money. Maybe Brianna found a way to break that cycle. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and walked out into the hallway that had seemed so intimidating an hour earlier. Now it felt different, not like a place where I didn't belong, but like a space I'd have to learn to navigate. The elevator ride down seemed to take forever. Through the glass walls, I could see the city sprawling out below, thousands of people going about their daily lives, unaware that somewhere in a law office, High above them, a power plant worker had just inherited an empire built by the woman who'd broken his heart 15 years ago. As I stepped out onto the busy sidewalk, I pulled out my phone and scrolled to Dustin's number. We needed to talk, needed to figure out how to rebuild some kind of relationship from the wreckage of this revelation. But when I pressed call, it went straight to voicemail. Dustin, it's Dad. I know you're hurt and angry and you have every right to be. But we're still family, and your mother, she loved us both, even if she had a strange way of showing it. Call me when you're ready. I hung up and started walking, not really caring where I was going. The February air was cold and sharp, cutting through my suit jacket, but I barely felt it. My mind was reeling, trying to process everything that had happened. Brianna's letter was folded in my jacket pocket, and I could feel it there like a weight against my chest. 15 years of believing I'd failed her, that I hadn't been enough, that my simple dreams and modest ambitions had somehow been inadequate. And all along she'd been building an empire while wondering if she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent years feeling like a failure because I couldn't give her the life she wanted. Now she was giving me the life I'd never dreamed of asking for, and I had no idea what to do with it. As I walked through the downtown streets, past coffee shops and office buildings and people in expensive suits, hurrying to important meetings, one thought kept echoing in my mind: Brianna had never stopped loving me. Through all the fights, the divorce, the years of silence, some part of her had held on to what we'd once had together. And now she was gone, and I was alone with a fortune I'd never wanted, and a son who looked at me like I'd stolen his birthright. The weight of it, all the money, the responsibility, the lost time, the love that had been hiding in plain sight for 15 years threatened to crush me. But I kept walking one foot in front of the other, carrying Brianna's final gift toward an uncertain future that would change everything for all of us. The walk back to my apartment took nearly an hour, but I needed every minute to try and process what had just happened. My small one-bedroom place on the east side felt even more cramped than usual when I finally pushed through the door. The contrast between my modest surroundings and my new reality almost surreal. The faded couch, the secondhand television, the kitchen table I'd bought at a garage sale 10 years ago, everything looked exactly the same, but I felt like a stranger in my own life. I sat down heavily and pulled out Brianna's letter, reading it again in the quiet of my apartment. Her handwriting was as elegant as ever, but I could see places where her hand had trembled slightly, probably from the chemotherapy. The woman who had built a $34 million empire had been afraid when she wrote this vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen since the early days of our marriage. My phone rang, startling me out of my thoughts. The caller ID showed my sister Maria's name, and I realized she'd probably heard about the funeral through the local news. Chen Industries was big enough that Brianna's death had made the business pages. Jerry, I just saw the obituary. I'm so sorry, honey. I know you two had your problems, but still... Thanks, Maria. It's been a difficult few days. I couldn't even begin to explain what had really happened. How do you tell someone that your ex-wife just left you enough money to buy a small country? How's Dustin handling it? I know he was close to his mother. I thought about my son's face in Morrison's office, the way his entire world had crumbled in the span of a few sentences. He's struggling, we all are. Well, if you need anything, you know Roberto and I are here for you. Maybe you could come over for dinner this weekend. The kids would love to see their Uncle Jerry. The normalcy of the invitation almost made me laugh. Dinner with my sister's family, playing with my teenage niece and nephew, pretending everything was exactly as it had been this morning. I'd like that, Maria. I'll call you later in the week. After hanging up, I found myself staring at the letter again, focusing on one particular passage. Use this money to take care of people. Use the business to make a positive difference. Easy words to write, but what did they actually mean? How does someone like me, someone who'd spent his entire adult life taking orders, suddenly become responsible for making decisions that could affect hundreds of employees? The phone rang again, and this time it was a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Mr. Flores, this is David Chen, Brianna's business partner. I just heard about the will reading, and I wanted to reach out. David Chen. I'd heard the name, but never met him. He was Brianna's right-hand man at the company, the one who'd helped her navigate the complexities of rapid expansion over the past decade. I'm sure this is all very overwhelming. He continued, his voice warm and professional. I was wondering if we could meet sometime soon. There are some things about the business you should know, and frankly, some decisions that can't wait too long. The reality of it hit me like a sledgehammer. This wasn't just about money sitting in bank accounts. There were real people depending on Chen Industries for their livelihoods. Real decisions that needed to be made by someone who supposedly knew what they were doing. I don't know anything about running a business, Mr. Chen. I think there might have been some mistake. He chuckled softly. Please call me David. And there was no mistake. Brianna talked about you more often than you might think, especially these past few months. She had very specific reasons for her decision. She talked about me. Often. She used to say that you were the only person she'd ever met who could make hard decisions based on what was right rather than what was profitable. In her line of work, that's rarer than you might think. I found myself gripping the phone tighter. David, I work at a power plant. I punch a time clock. I don't know the first thing about corporate strategy or market analysis or whatever it is you people do. But you know about people. You know about leadership. You know about integrity. Brianna believed those qualities were more important than any MBA. He paused. Look, why don't I come by tomorrow morning? We can talk about how this transition might work. No pressure, just information. After we set a time to meet, I hung up feeling even more overwhelmed than before. The weight of responsibility was settling on my shoulders like a lead blanket, and I had no idea how to carry it. I tried calling Dustin again, but it still went straight to voicemail. This time I didn't leave a message. What could I possibly say that would make any of this better? The evening passed in a blur of restless pacing and unanswered questions. I made a sandwich, but couldn't eat it. I turned on the television, but couldn't focus on anything. Finally, around midnight, I gave up on sleep and sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a legal pad trying to make sense of what I knew about Chen Industries. It wasn't much. I knew Brianna had started with commercial real estate buying and renovating small office buildings. From there, she'd expanded into property management, then development, then into related services like construction and facilities management. Over the years, the company had grown into something much larger and more complex with subsidiaries I'd never heard of, and business relationships that spanned multiple states. I found myself thinking about the last real conversation Brianna and I had. Not one of those polite exchanges at family gatherings, but an actual conversation. It had been about 3 years ago at Dustin's birthday party. She'd been standing alone on the patio of her beautiful house, looking out at the manicured garden, and for a moment she'd looked almost lost. It's a beautiful place, I'd said, joining her outside. Thank you. The landscaping alone cost more than most people make in a year. She'd said it without pride, almost like she was confessing something shameful. But you're not happy here. She'd turned to look at me, then really look at me, and for a second I'd seen something in her eyes that reminded me of the woman I'd fallen in love with. Happiness is a luxury I gave up a long time ago, Jerry. Success is more reliable. Is it, though, more reliable? She'd been quiet for a long moment. Some days I'm not sure anymore. That conversation had stuck with me, probably because it was the only time in years that she'd let her guard down even slightly. Now, reading her letter again in the harsh light of my kitchen fluorescents, I wondered if that had been her way of reaching out, of testing whether the connection between us was completely severed. The next morning came too quickly, and not quickly enough. I'd managed maybe 2 hours of sleep, and I felt like I'd been hit by a truck. David Chen arrived precisely at 9 o'clock, and I was surprised by how young he looked. I'd expected someone older, more distinguished, but David couldn't have been more than 40, with an easy smile and the kind of casual confidence that came from years of success. Thank you for agreeing to meet, he said as I led him into my modest living room. I saw him glance around, taking in the humble surroundings, but his expression didn't change. I brought some basic information about the company's current status, just to give you a starting point. He set a leather briefcase on my coffee table and pulled out several folders. I want to start by saying that the transition doesn't have to happen overnight. The company has excellent managers in every division, and most of our operations are quite stable. Your role, at least initially, would be more about major strategic decisions and overall direction. David, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I'm not qualified for this. Surely there's someone else, someone with actual business experience. He smiled. Can I tell you something Brianna said to me about 6 months ago? We were dealing with a situation where one of our contractors was using undocumented workers and paying them below minimum wage. It would have been cheaper to look the other way, and legally, we weren't directly responsible. But Brianna insisted we terminate the contract and report the violations to the appropriate authorities. That sounds like her. When I asked her why she was willing to lose money and potentially face legal complications over something that wasn't technically our problem, she said, David, there are 2 ways to make decisions in business. You can ask what Jerry would do, or you can ask what will make the most money. I've spent 15 years choosing wrong. I stared at him, not quite believing what I was hearing. She really said that. She talked about you a lot these past few months. About your integrity, your loyalty to your coworkers, the way you treated people regardless of their position or status. She believed those qualities were exactly what Chen Industries needed. David opened one of the folders and spread several documents across my coffee table. Look, I'm not going to lie to you. This is a complex business with a lot of moving parts. But complexity doesn't necessarily mean difficulty. Most of what we do comes down to treating people fairly, making ethical decisions and thinking long-term instead of just focusing on quarterly profits. I picked up one of the documents, a financial summary that might as well have been written in ancient Greek. David, I can barely understand what I'm looking at here. That's what advisors are for. That's what I'm for. You don't need to become an accountant or a legal expert overnight. You need to be a leader. And according to Brianna, you've been doing that your whole life without realizing it. Over the next hour, David walked me through the basics of how the company operated. Chen Industries employed nearly 800 people across various divisions. There was the original real estate development arm, which handled everything from small commercial renovations to major mixed-use projects. The property management division oversaw more than 50 buildings throughout the metropolitan area. The construction subsidiary handled both company projects and outside contracts. The numbers are impressive, David said, showing me a chart of revenue growth over the past 5 years. But Brianna always said the real measure of our success was how we treated our people. We have one of the lowest employee turnover rates in the industry, partly because we pay above market wages and provide excellent benefits. She did that. She insisted on it, said she'd learned from someone that taking care of your employees was more important than maximizing profits. He looked at me meaningfully. I always wondered who had taught her that lesson. I thought about my years at the power plant, about the fights I'd had with management over worker safety and fair scheduling. I'd never considered those battles to be lessons in business philosophy, but maybe they were. David, what happens if I screw this up? What happens to all those people if I make the wrong decisions? The same thing that happens in any business when leaders make mistakes, you learn from them and do better next time. But Jerry, can I ask you something? In all your years at the power plant, did you ever make a decision that you knew would hurt your coworkers just to benefit yourself? Of course not. Then you're already ahead of about half the CEOs I know. We spent another hour going over organizational charts and key personnel. I learned about department heads who'd been with the company for years, about ongoing projects and upcoming challenges. It was overwhelming, but David had a way of breaking things down that made them seem manageable. There's something else you should know, he said as he prepared to leave. Dustin called me yesterday afternoon. My stomach dropped. What did he say? He wanted to know if I thought the will could be successfully contested. He also asked if I'd be willing to testify about Brianna's mental state in recent months. And what did you tell him? David closed his briefcase carefully. I told him that his mother was sharper and more focused in her final months than I'd seen her in years. The cancer diagnosis seemed to clarify her thinking rather than cloud it. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she had very specific reasons for every decision. After he left, I sat alone in my living room, surrounded by folders full of information about a business I now supposedly owned. The magnitude of it all was still sinking in. 800 employees, dozens of ongoing projects, millions of dollars in assets and liabilities. And at the center of it all, me, a guy who'd spent 23 years watching steam gauges and maintaining electrical systems. I thought about Brianna building all of this starting with nothing and growing it into an empire through sheer force of will and intelligence. How could she possibly have believed I was capable of maintaining what she'd created, let alone improving on it? My phone buzzed with a text message from a number I didn't recognize. Dad, it's Dustin. I'm staying at the Marriott downtown, room 1247. We need to talk. The hotel was only a 20-minute drive from my apartment, but it felt like crossing into another world. The Marriott was the kind of place where business deals worth millions were discussed over expensive lunches, where people in $1,000 suits made decisions that affected thousands of lives. I felt every bit the imposter walking through the marble lobby in my work clothes. Dustin answered the door on the first knock, and I was shocked by his appearance. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled like he'd slept in it. His eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, and he looked like he'd aged 5 years overnight. Come in, Dad. His voice was flat, emotionless. The hotel room was spacious and elegant, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. But Dustin had clearly been pacing for hours. There were papers scattered across the bed, empty coffee cups on every surface, and his laptop open to what looked like legal websites. I've been doing research, he said without preamble. Talking to lawyers looking into precedents for contesting wills based on mental incapacity or undue influence. I sat down in one of the room's plush chairs. And what did you find? That Mom was too smart for her own good. She documented everything. Medical records showing she was mentally competent. Witness statements about her decision-making process. She even had psychological evaluations done to prove she understood the implications of her choices. He laughed bitterly. It's like she knew exactly what I'd try to do and cut off every possible avenue. Maybe she just wanted to make sure her final wishes were respected. Dustin whirled around to face me. Her final wishes. Dad, do you have any idea what you're taking away from me? This isn't just money we're talking about. This was my life's work. I've spent the last 8 years preparing to run Chen Industries. I know every employee, every project, every client relationship. I've sacrificed everything, relationships, friendships, any kind of personal life to be ready for this moment. The pain in his voice was raw and real, and I felt my heart breaking for him. Son, I never asked for any of this. If there was a way to give it back to you, I would. Would you really? He sat down on the edge of the bed, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion. Because there might be a way. What do you mean? You could refuse the inheritance, or you could accept it and then immediately transfer everything to me. Legally, it's possible. Complicated, but possible. I studied my son's face, seeing desperation there alongside the anger. Is that what you want me to do? I don't know. He ran his hands through his hair. Yesterday, I would have said yes without hesitation. But I've been thinking about what Mom wrote in that letter about the things she said about both of us. What about it? She wasn't wrong, Dad. About me, I mean. I have become everything she trained me to be, and maybe that's not entirely a good thing. He looked out the window at the city sprawling below. Do you know what I did last month when I found out one of our cleaning contractors was having financial problems? I shook my head. I negotiated a lower rate for our contract knowing it would probably force him to lay off workers. It saved the company maybe $15,000, which is basically a rounding error in our annual budget. But I did it anyway because that's what I thought a good businessman would do. The admission hung in the air between us like a confession. Your mother and I made mistakes raising you, I said quietly. We were so focused on our own problems that we didn't pay enough attention to what kind of person you were becoming. She saw it, though. In the end, she saw exactly what I'd become. Dustin's voice was barely above a whisper. The question is, can I become something different? We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us lost in our own thoughts. Finally, Dustin spoke again. I called my assistant this morning and told her I was taking a leave of absence from Chen Industries. Indefinitely. Dustin. No, let me finish. I've been thinking about what Mom said about needing to build my own future instead of inheriting one. Maybe she was right. Maybe I do need to figure out who I am when I'm not just Brianna Chen's son, an heir apparent. I wanted to argue with him to tell him he was overreacting, but the truth was that I could see the wisdom in what Brianna had done. Dustin had been living his entire adult life in preparation for a moment that was now never going to come. Maybe forcing him to change direction was the only way to help him find his own path. What will you do? I don't know yet. Maybe I'll travel for a while, see some of the world outside boardrooms and conference calls. Maybe I'll go back to school, study something I actually care about, instead of just what would make me a better businessman. Or maybe I'll start small, build something from the ground up like Mom did. That takes courage. Does it? Or is it just the only option I have left? He looked at me directly for the first time since I'd arrived. What about you, Dad? What are you going to do with an empire you never wanted? It was a fair question, and I wished I had a good answer. I honestly don't know. David Chen thinks I can learn the business side of things, but I'm not sure I believe him. David's a good guy. Brilliant, actually. If anyone can help you figure this out, it's him. Dustin paused. You know, it's funny. I spent years resenting him because Mom trusted his judgment so much. But now I'm thinking maybe I should have been learning from him instead of competing with him. It's not too late for that. Isn't it? I mean, he works for you now. How weird is that going to be? The strangeness of it all hit me again. Yesterday, I'd been Jerry Flores' power plant worker. Today, I was Jerry Flores' CEO of a multi-million-dollar company with my own son as one of my displaced employees. Dustin, I want you to know that whatever happens with the business, whatever I decide to do, you'll always be my son. This money, this company, none of it is more important than that. For the first time since the will reading, I saw something soften in his expression. I know, Dad. I think I lost sight of that for a while, but I know. And I want you to know that your mother's letter didn't change how I feel about you. You're not the villain in this story. We all made choices that led us here. Dustin nodded slowly. I've been angry at you for taking something I thought was mine. But the truth is, I'm mostly angry at myself for becoming someone she didn't trust with it. We talked for another hour, really talked in a way we hadn't since he was a teenager. He told me about the pressure he'd felt to live up to Brianna's expectations, about how success at Chen Industries had become his entire identity. I told him about the years after the divorce, about feeling like a failure because I couldn't provide the kind of life his mother wanted. She never called you a failure, Dad, Dustin said as I was preparing to leave. Disappointed, maybe? Frustrated? But never a failure. What's the difference? A failure is someone who doesn't try. A disappointed person is someone who tries but doesn't succeed the way you expected them to. Maybe Mom finally realized that succeeding the way she expected wasn't necessarily the same thing as succeeding in life. As I drove home from the hotel, I found myself thinking about success and failure, about expectations and disappointments, about the different ways people measure a life well lived. Brianna had achieved everything she'd set out to achieve: wealth, power, respect, recognition. But in her final letter, she'd made it clear that none of those achievements had brought her the happiness she'd been seeking. I thought about my own life, about 23 years of steady work, of being reliable and honest and caring about my coworkers. I'd never made a lot of money or achieved anything that would make the newspaper obituaries. But I'd paid my bills, helped people when I could, and tried to live according to the values my parents had taught me. Maybe that was its own kind of success. Back at my apartment, I found 3 more messages on my answering machine. One was from Morrison's office asking me to schedule a meeting to begin the formal transfer process. Another was from someone at Chen Industries, a department head I'd never heard of, who wanted to introduce herself and discuss some upcoming projects. The third was from a reporter at the Business Journal asking for a statement about the surprise succession at Chen Industries. I didn't return any of the calls. Instead, I made myself a simple dinner and sat down with Brianna's letter one more time. There was a phrase that kept catching my attention. Show our son what real success looks like. What did real success look like? Was it building a business empire, accumulating wealth, achieving recognition and power? Or was it something simpler and more fundamental? Treating people with dignity, making decisions based on principle rather than profit, using whatever resources you had to make the world a little bit better. I thought about the 800 people who worked for Chen Industries, about their families and their hopes and their daily struggles. In accepting Brianna's inheritance, I wasn't just taking on money and property. I was taking responsibility for all those lives, all those livelihoods. The weight of that responsibility was almost paralyzing. But maybe that was exactly why she'd chosen me. Maybe she believed that someone who was afraid of the power would be more likely to use it wisely than someone who had always craved it. The phone rang again, interrupting my thoughts. This time it was Maria checking in to see how I was doing. "Jerry, you sound different. Tired, maybe?" "It's been a complicated day, sis." "Want to talk about it?" I looked around my small apartment at the humble surroundings that would probably change dramatically in the coming weeks. Not yet, but soon, I think. There are some things I need to figure out first. After we hung up, I realized that talking to Maria had helped clarify something important. Whatever I decided to do with Brianna's gift, I needed to make sure it didn't change who I was at my core. Money and power could corrupt people, but they could also be tools for good in the right hands. The challenge would be keeping my hands worthy of the trust Brianna had placed in them. I spent the rest of the evening reading through the materials David had left, trying to understand the scope of what I was inheriting. It wasn't just a business. It was a responsibility to hundreds of families, to the communities where Chen Industries operated, to the vision of ethical business practices that Brianna had apparently been trying to build in her final years. As I finally prepared for bed, I realized that tomorrow would be different from any day I'd ever lived. Tomorrow, I would have to start making decisions that affected more than just my own life. Tomorrow, I would have to begin learning how to be the kind of leader Brianna believed I could become. But tonight, I was still just Jerry Flores, a guy from the east side of town who'd loved and lost, and somehow found himself holding the future in his calloused hands. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now that was enough. The next morning brought a steady rain that matched my mood as I stood in front of my closet staring at clothes that suddenly seemed inadequate for the life I was about to enter. My work uniforms hung there like ghosts of a simpler time, when my biggest decision was whether to take overtime or spend the evening at home with a beer and a baseball game. I settled on my only decent suit, the same navy blue one I'd worn to the will reading, and headed out into a world that looked the same but felt completely different. The drive to Chen Industries headquarters took me through neighborhoods I'd known my entire life, past the diner, where Brianna and I had our first date, past the church where we'd gotten married 24 years ago. The Chen Industries building rose 12 stories above the downtown business district, all glass and steel and corporate ambition. I'd driven past it thousands of times over the years, but I'd never imagined myself walking through the front doors as anything more than a visitor. Now, according to a legal document that still felt surreal, I owned the place. The security guard at the front desk looked up as I approached, his expression polite but curious. "Can I help you, sir?" "I'm Jerry Flores. I have an appointment with David Chen." He consulted his computer, then looked up with surprise. "Of course, Mr. Flores. Mr. Chen is expecting you. 12th floor executive suite." The elevator ride seemed to last forever, stopping at various floors where people in expensive suits got on and off, talking about contracts and market analyses and quarterly projections in voices that suggested these conversations were as natural as discussing the weather. I caught a few curious glances, probably because I looked like someone who'd taken a wrong turn on his way to a job interview. David was waiting when the elevator doors opened on the 12th floor. "Jerry, good morning. How are you holding up?" "About as well as you'd expect for someone who inherited a company he doesn't know how to run." He smiled sympathetically as he led me down a hallway lined with photographs of completed projects, office buildings, shopping centers, residential complexes that Chen Industries had developed over the years. "Let me show you around first, then we'll sit down and talk about the immediate issues." The executive floor was intimidating in its quiet elegance. Thick carpeting muffled our footsteps as we passed offices occupied by people who looked up from their work with expressions ranging from curious to concerned. Word had obviously spread about the inheritance, and I could practically feel the questions hanging in the air around us. "This was Brianna's office," David said, stopping in front of a set of mahogany double doors. "It's yours now whenever you're ready for it." He opened the doors to reveal a space that was both impressive and somehow personal. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the city, while the walls displayed a mixture of business awards and family photographs. There was a picture of Dustin's college graduation, another of him receiving some kind of business achievement award. But what caught my attention was a smaller photograph tucked into a corner of the bookshelf, a candid shot of Brianna and me from our early years together, both of us laughing at some long-forgotten joke. "She kept that there?" I asked, moving closer to examine the photo. "For as long as I've known her. Sometimes I'd catch her looking at it during difficult meetings, like it reminded her of something important. David's voice was gentle. She never talked about her personal life much, but that picture seemed to matter to her. I picked up the photograph, remembering the day it was taken. We'd been at a company picnic for the power plant probably 6 months after we'd gotten married. Brianna had been nervous about fitting in with my coworkers, worried that her law school education would make her seem pretentious. Instead, she'd charmed everyone by helping with the food service and getting genuinely interested in their stories about plant operations. She was different then. I said more to myself than to David. People change. Sometimes they change back. He gestured toward the massive desk that dominated the center of the room. The transition doesn't have to happen all at once. You can use this office when you need to, but there's no pressure to move in immediately. We spent the next hour touring the various departments. David introduced me to key personnel department heads who'd been with the company for years, project managers overseeing million-dollar developments, accountants who could make sense of financial statements that looked like hieroglyphics to me. Everyone was polite, professional, and clearly wondering what the hell I was doing there. Mr. Flores, sucky spot, said Margaret Walsh, the head of property management. I wanted you to know that we're all committed to maintaining the high standards Mrs. Chen established. If there's anything you need to know about our operations, please don't hesitate to ask. Her tone was respectful but guarded, and I could see the concern in her eyes. These people had built their careers under Brianna's leadership, and now they were facing an uncertain future with a new boss who had no experience in their industry. Margaret, I appreciate that, and I want you all to know that I'm not here to disrupt what's working. I have a lot to learn, and I'm hoping you'll all be patient with me while I figure this out. The relief on her face was visible. Of course, sir. We're here to help however we can. After the tour, David and I returned to a smaller conference room where he'd assembled what he called the immediate issues folder. Even the immediate issues seemed overwhelming contract negotiations that needed approval, personnel decisions that couldn't be delayed, city planning meetings where Chen Industries needed to be represented. The good news, but, David said, spreading documents across the conference table, is that most of these decisions are relatively straightforward. Brianna built good systems and hired competent people. A lot of what you'll be doing, at least initially, is reviewing recommendations and applying your judgment to situations where the answer isn't obvious. And what if my judgment is wrong? Then you'll learn from the mistake and do better next time. That's how everyone learns to run a business. He pulled out a particularly thick folder. But there is one situation that's a bit more complicated and time-sensitive. I braced myself for whatever was coming next. We're in the middle of negotiations for a major development project on the south side. Mixed-use residential and commercial, about a $40 million investment. The city council is voting on the zoning approval next week, and there are some community concerns we need to address. What kind of concerns? The usual stuff with development projects. Traffic parking impact on local businesses. But there's also a more sensitive issue. David's expression grew serious. The development site includes several buildings that are currently low-income housing. The residents would need to be relocated. I felt my stomach drop. How many people are we talking about? About 60 families. Mostly working-class folks, some elderly residents, a few single mothers with children. The city has relocation assistance programs, but it's still disruptive to their lives. This was exactly the kind of situation that had destroyed my marriage to Brianna. The conflict between business interests and human consequences. I could practically hear our old arguments echoing in my head. What was Brianna's position on this? David hesitated. She approved the project before she got sick. But lately, she'd been having second thoughts. She asked me to look into alternative sites, but nothing comparable has come available. And if we pull out of the project, we lose the money we've already invested in planning and permits, probably about $2 million. Plus, there are contractual obligations to our partners and subcontractors. It wouldn't bankrupt the company, but it would be a significant hit. I stared at the architectural drawings spread across the table, trying to imagine the families who would be displaced by those clean lines and impressive facades. 60 families. Children who would have to change schools, elderly people who would lose their community connections, working parents who might face longer commutes or higher rent. I need to see the site, I said finally. David looked surprised. See it? I need to see where these people live, talk to some of them if possible. I can't make a decision like this based on paperwork and architectural drawings. Jerry, well, it's not usually how these things are handled. Developers typically maintain some distance from the displacement process. Maybe that's part of the problem. I stood up, my decision crystallizing as I spoke. Can you arrange for me to visit the site this afternoon? The drive to the south side took us through neighborhoods that gradually shifted from corporate prosperity to working-class reality. The buildings got older, the cars less expensive, the storefronts more likely to advertise check-cashing services than investment opportunities. This was the part of the city where people like me lived, where every dollar mattered, and unexpected expenses could derail a family's entire financial stability. The development site was a cluster of 3-story apartment buildings that had probably been built in the 1960s. They weren't pretty red brick facades that had weathered to a dull brown, small windows, minimal landscaping, but they were clean and well-maintained, with children's bicycles in the courtyards and flower boxes on some of the balconies. This wasn't a slum. It was home to people who were making the best of modest circumstances. The buildings are structurally sound, David explained as we walked through the central courtyard. But they're not economically viable for renovation. The construction costs would exceed what we could charge for rent in this neighborhood. A woman emerged from one of the ground floor apartments carrying a basket of laundry toward a communal laundry room. She was probably in her 40s with graying hair and the kind of tired eyes that suggested she worked long hours at a difficult job. When she saw us, she stopped and stared with the suspicious expression of someone who recognized potential trouble. "Excuse me," I called out. "Could I talk to you for a minute?" She looked wary but approached slowly. "You're the developers, aren't you? The ones who want to tear down our homes?" "I'm Jerry Flores. I recently became involved with Chen Industries, and I wanted to understand how this project would affect the people who live here." Her expression softened slightly at my informal approach. "I'm Rosa Martinez. I've lived here for 8 years. My kids go to school 2 blocks away, and I work at the hospital about 15 minutes from here. This place isn't fancy, but it's affordable, and it's become our community." "What would happen if you had to move?" Rosa's face tightened with worry. "There aren't many places in the city where I can afford rent on a nurse's aide salary. The relocation assistance would help with moving expenses, but finding a new place that's still close to my job and my kids' school, that's going to be nearly impossible." As we talked, other residents began to emerge from their apartments, drawn by curiosity about the strangers in their courtyard. There was an elderly man named Frank who'd lived in the same apartment for 15 years and knew every neighbor by name. A young mother named Jessica, whose daughter had just started kindergarten at the local school. A mechanic named Carlos, who ran a small auto repair business out of a rented garage nearby. Each of them told a similar story. These apartments weren't luxury housing, but they were stable, affordable homes in a community where people looked out for each other. The children had friends here, the adults had support networks, the elderly residents had familiar routines that kept them connected to the world. "We're not against development," Frank explained as we sat on benches in the courtyard. "We know the city needs to grow and change, but it feels like every time something gets built, it's the working folks who get pushed out to make room for people with more money." "Is there anything that would make this transition easier?" I asked. Rosa exchanged glances with the other residents. "Honestly, time would help the most. If we had 6 months or a year to find new places to save up for moving expenses, to help our kids adjust to the idea of changing schools. The city's timeline has everything happening in just a few weeks." David and I spent almost 2 hours talking with residents, and by the time we left, I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. These weren't abstract numbers on a development plan. They were real people with real lives who were about to be uprooted for the sake of a project that would primarily benefit people who were already wealthy. "So what are you thinking?" David asked as we drove back downtown. "I'm thinking that maybe there's a reason Brianna was having second thoughts about this project." "Jerry, I understand the humanitarian concerns, but we have to consider the broader implications. Chen Industries has a responsibility to its investors, its employees, its other projects. One decision like this can affect the company's reputation and future opportunities." I knew he was right from a business perspective. But I also knew that if I approved this project, I'd be no different from the executives I'd spent my career resenting people who treated human consequences as acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of profit.
What if we modified the timeline, gave people more time to relocate? That would increase our carrying costs and delay the construction schedule. Plus, we'd have to renegotiate contracts with our partners and subcontractors. How much would that cost? David pulled out his phone and started calculating. Probably another $1 million in additional expenses and lost revenue. $3 million to do the right thing. It sounded like an enormous sum, but in the context of a $40 million project and a $34 million inheritance, it was manageable. Set up a meeting with our partners and the city planners, I said. Let's see if we can restructure the timeline to give people 6 months instead of 6 weeks. David looked at me with something that might have been respect. That's going to be a hard sell. Everyone involved is expecting to move quickly. Then we'll have to be persuasive.
Back at the office, word of our site visit had apparently spread throughout the building. I caught people glancing at me with expressions that ranged from curiosity to approval. Margaret Walsh stopped by the conference room where David and I were working. "Mr. Flores, I heard you visited the South Side development site today. That's not something Mrs. Chen would have done, at least not in recent years." "Why not?" Margaret chose her words carefully. Mrs. Chen believed in maintaining professional distance from the human impact of business decisions. She said it was necessary to avoid letting emotions cloud business judgment. "And what do you think?" "I think there's a difference between letting emotions cloud your judgment and letting empathy inform your decisions." She paused. "For what it's worth, several of us have been uncomfortable with the South Side project timeline. We just didn't feel it was our place to say anything." After Margaret left, David and I worked until nearly 8 o'clock developing a proposal that would extend the relocation timeline and increase support for displaced residents. It would cost money and complicate the project logistics, but it would also ensure that 60 families weren't thrown into crisis for the sake of a development schedule. "You know," David said as we were preparing to leave, "this isn't the first time someone has suggested slowing down the South Side project. Brianna received several letters from residents and community advocates asking for more time. What did she do with the letters?" "Filed them away. Said that business decisions couldn't be made based on individual hardship stories." He looked at me thoughtfully. "But in her final weeks, she kept asking me about those letters. I think she was reconsidering her position." The drive home gave me time to think about the day's events. In the span of a few hours, I'd gone from inheriting a business to making decisions that would affect dozens of families. The weight of that responsibility was enormous, but it also felt strangely familiar. Every day at the power plant, I'd made decisions that affected my coworkers, covering shifts for people with sick children, speaking up about safety concerns, advocating for fair treatment from management. The scale was different now, but the fundamental principle was the same, looking out for people who had less power than you did. My phone rang as I pulled into my apartment complex parking lot. It was Dustin, and he sounded different, less angry, more thoughtful. "Dad, I heard you went to see the South Side development site today. News travels fast. I still have friends at the company. They're saying you spent the afternoon talking to residents trying to understand how the project would affect them." There was a pause. "Mom never did that. She always said it was important to maintain professional objectivity. Maybe professional objectivity is overrated." "Maybe it is." Dustin's voice was quiet. "Dad, can I ask you something? Are you going to try to change how the company operates, or are you just going to maintain what Mom built?" It was a fair question and one I'd been wrestling with all day. "I don't know yet, but I think your mother was starting to question some of her own decisions. Maybe change was already happening before I got involved. The Southside project was one of the things we argued about. I thought the timeline was too aggressive, that we weren't considering the human impact. She said I was being naive, that business couldn't function if we tried to solve everyone's problems. What do you think now?" "Now I think maybe there's a middle ground between solving everyone's problems and ignoring them completely." He paused. "Dad, I've been thinking about what we talked about yesterday, about me finding my own path. What if I started with trying to make amends for some of the decisions I supported when I was at the company? What do you mean? There are other projects like the South Side development, other situations where we prioritize profits over people. Maybe I could work with community organizations, help them advocate for better terms or alternative solutions. It wouldn't undo the damage, but it might help prevent future problems. I found myself smiling for the first time in days. That sounds like something worth doing. It wouldn't pay much, if anything, but I've got enough money for Mom's bequest to live modestly for a while. And maybe learning to live modestly wouldn't be such a bad thing. After we hung up, I sat in my car for a few more minutes thinking about the strange turns life had taken. 3 days ago, Dustin had been groomed to inherit an empire, and I'd been a power plant worker counting the years until retirement. Now he was talking about community advocacy, and I was trying to figure out how to run a business according to principles that prioritize people over profits. The irony wasn't lost on me. Brianna had spent 15 years building a company and raising a son according to one set of values, then used her final act to force both of us toward a completely different approach to life and business. Whether that would ultimately prove to be wisdom or wishful thinking remained to be seen. Inside my apartment, I found myself looking at the family photographs scattered around my living room, pictures from better times when Dustin was young and Brianna and I were still figuring out how to build a life together. In one photo, we were painting the kitchen of our first house, all of us covered in more paint than the walls. Brianna was laughing at something Dustin had said, and I was looking at both of them with an expression of pure contentment. That was the woman who had written the letter Morrison had read. The woman who had remembered what mattered most, even as she was dying. Somewhere along the way, she'd lost sight of those priorities, but in the end, she'd found them again. Now it was up to me to honor the trust she'd placed in me, to use the power she'd given me in ways that would have made the woman in that photograph proud. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions that would affect real people's lives. But tonight I felt something I hadn't experienced since the divorce, a sense of purpose that went beyond just getting through another day. Maybe that was the real gift Brianna had left me, not just the money or the business, but the opportunity to make a difference in ways I'd never imagined possible. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of meetings, phone calls, and crash courses in corporate finance that made my head spin. David had arranged for me to work with a business consultant named Patricia Hawkins, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who had a gift for translating complex business concepts into language I could actually understand. Think of cash flow like the electrical systems you worked with at the power plant, she explained during one of our sessions. Money has to keep moving through the business, and if there's a bottleneck anywhere in the system, everything downstream gets affected. It was a helpful analogy, and gradually I began to see patterns in the financial reports that had initially looked like meaningless columns of numbers. Chen Industries was profitable, but not as profitable as it could be. There were inefficiencies in some operations, missed opportunities in others, and a few projects that were essentially breaking even when they should have been generating significant returns. The Southside development had become a test case for my new approach to business. After 2 contentious meetings with our partners and city planners, we'd managed to negotiate a modified timeline that gave residents 4 months to relocate instead of 4 weeks. It cost us an additional $1.8 million in carrying costs and delayed revenue, but it also generated something I hadn't expected: positive media coverage. Local developer puts people first in Southside project, read the headline in the city's main newspaper. The article quoted Rosa Martinez praising Chen Industries for listening to community concerns, and it mentioned that several other residents had been able to find suitable alternative housing thanks to the extended timeline. "This is good publicity," David said, showing me the newspaper over coffee in what was slowly becoming my office. I'd started spending a few hours each day in Brianna's former space, though I still felt like an intruder every time I sat behind her massive desk. But I have to warn you, not everyone is happy about the precedent we're setting. "What do you mean?" "I got a call yesterday from Richard Blackstone, one of our major investors. He's concerned that prioritizing social impact over profit margins could hurt the company's competitiveness." Richard Blackstone was a name I'd heard mentioned in several meetings, a real estate mogul who had partnered with Chen Industries on multiple projects over the years. According to David, Blackstone had been one of Brianna's mentors when she was starting the company and his investment had been crucial to several major expansions. What specifically is he concerned about? He thinks you're too soft for this business. His words, not mine. David's expression was carefully neutral. He wants to meet with you to discuss the future direction of the company. The meeting was scheduled for the following Friday at Blackstone's downtown office, which occupied the top floor of one of the city's most prestigious buildings. I spent the week reading everything I could find about Blackstone's business philosophy and trying to anticipate his objections to my approach. Just remember, David advised as we rode the elevator to Blackstone's office. He's not just an investor. He's been like a father figure to a lot of people in this industry, including Brianna. His opinion carries a lot of weight. Richard Blackstone was exactly what I'd expected, tall, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, with the kind of commanding presence that filled a room the moment he entered it. His office was a monument to success, with awards and photographs documenting decades of major deals and influential relationships. Jerry Flores, he said, rising from behind a desk that was even more impressive than Brianna's. I've been looking forward to meeting you. Please sit down. His handshake was firm, his smile warm, but I could see the assessment going on behind his eyes. He was taking my measure, trying to figure out what kind of businessman I might become. I understand you've made some interesting changes to the Southside project, he said without preamble. I felt we needed to be more considerate of the impact on existing residents. Considerate? He repeated the word like he was tasting something unfamiliar. That's an interesting word choice for a business decision that cost your company nearly $2 million. It was the right thing to do. Blackstone leaned back in his chair, studying me with the intensity of a chess player considering his next move. Jerry, can I give you some advice? In this business, the right thing to do is whatever maximizes value for your shareholders and stakeholders. Everything else is a luxury you can't afford if you want to stay competitive. With respect, Mr. Blackstone, I'm not sure I agree with that philosophy. Call me Richard, and tell me what happens when your competitors are willing to cut corners that you won't cut. When they can deliver projects faster and cheaper because they don't worry about displaced residents or extended timelines. It was a fair question and one I'd been wrestling with myself. I think there are customers who value ethical business practices. Maybe we compete by offering something different rather than just trying to be the cheapest option. Ethical business practices. Richard smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Jerry, I helped Brianna build Chen Industries from nothing. When she started, she had your same idealistic notions about doing business the right way. Do you know what changed her mind? I shook my head. Reality. The first time she lost a major contract to a competitor who was willing to bribe city officials. The first time a subcontractor took advantage of her trust and nearly bankrupted a project. The first time she realized that playing by a different set of rules than everyone else wasn't noble, it was naive. Richard stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the city skyline that was dotted with buildings bearing his company's name. Brianna became successful because she learned to be pragmatic. She understood that sentiment doesn't pay salaries or fund pension plans or keep the lights on. But in her final letter, she seemed to be questioning those same pragmatic decisions. A dying woman's regrets aren't a business plan, Jerry. His voice was gentle but firm. Brianna was facing her mortality, wondering about the choices she'd made in her personal life. That doesn't mean her professional decisions were wrong. We talked for another hour, and I had to admit that Richard made compelling points. He showed me market analyses demonstrating how companies that prioritize social responsibility often struggle to compete with more aggressive competitors. He cited examples of well-intentioned businesses that had failed because they couldn't balance idealism with pragmatism. I'm not saying you should abandon your principles, he concluded as our meeting drew to a close. I'm saying you need to be smart about how you apply them. The business world is full of good people who failed because they let their hearts overrule their heads. The drive back to Chen Industries gave me plenty to think about. Richard's arguments were logical, persuasive, and supported by years of experience in an industry I barely understood. Maybe I was being naive. Maybe the Southside project was an expensive mistake that would set a dangerous precedent for future decisions. But when I got back to the office, I found Margaret Walsh waiting for me with a folder full of letters from residents of the Southside development. They were thank you notes expressing gratitude for the extended timeline and the way our company had treated them throughout the process. These started arriving yesterday, Margaret explained. Word has gotten out in the community about how we handled the relocation. We've had 3 other development opportunities brought to our attention by community groups who specifically want to work with us because of our approach to the Southside project. I opened one of the letters written in careful handwriting by an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson. Mr. Flores. It read, "Thank you for giving us time to find new homes with dignity. My grandson will be able to finish his senior year at the same high school now, and that means everything to our family. God bless you for remembering that we're people, not just obstacles to your progress." Margaret watched as I read several more letters. "There's something else you should know. We've had inquiries from 2 major clients who heard about the Southside project. They're interested in working with a development company that shares their values about corporate responsibility." "What kind of clients?" "One is a healthcare system that wants to build a new medical campus. The other is a university looking for partners on a mixed-use student housing project. Both contracts would be worth more than we lost on the Southside timeline extension." I found myself smiling for the first time since the meeting with Richard Blackstone. Maybe ethical business practices weren't just the right thing to do, maybe they were also good business. That evening I called Dustin to tell him about the letters and the new business opportunities. He'd been busy with his own transition, exploring volunteer opportunities with community advocacy groups and taking classes in social work and urban planning. "Dad, I have to tell you something," he said after I'd finished describing my day. "I've been talking to some of the residents from our other development projects, trying to understand the impact our business decisions had on their communities. And I'm ashamed of some of the things I supported when I was at the company. There was a housing complex in the West End that we bought and renovated, then raised the rent by 40%. Most of the original residents couldn't afford the new rates and had to move." I could hear the pain in his voice. "Son, you were doing what you thought was right based on the business principles you'd been taught." "But that's just it. I never questioned those principles. I never asked whether maximizing profits was worth displacing families or destroying communities. I just assumed that's how business worked." "What are you going to do about it?" "I'm working with a community organization to develop a fund that helps displaced residents with relocation costs and housing assistance. It won't undo the harm, but maybe it can help prevent similar situations in the future." After we hung up, I sat in my apartment thinking about the different paths that had led us all to this point. Brianna had built her empire by gradually abandoning the values that had once guided her decisions. Dustin had been shaped by those business-first principles until they became his default way of thinking. And now both of them were questioning the costs of that approach, trying to find a way back to something more human and sustainable. The next morning brought news that changed everything. David called me at 6:30, his voice tight with concern. "Jerry, we have a problem. I just got off the phone with the site supervisor at the Riverside Plaza project. There's been an accident." Riverside Plaza was one of Chen Industries' major current projects, a mixed-use development that had been under construction for 8 months. It was also one of our most profitable contracts with tight deadlines and even tighter margins. "What kind of accident?" "A scaffolding collapse. 3 workers were injured, 1 seriously. They're all at the hospital now." I felt my blood turn cold. "How did it happen?" "We don't know yet. The safety inspector is on site and OSHA is sending investigators. But Jerry, there's something else you need to know. The scaffolding company we're using, they're not our usual contractor." "What do you mean?" "Brianna switched to them about 6 months ago. They submitted a bid that was 30% lower than our regular scaffolding company." The implications hit me like a physical blow. We'd potentially saved money by using a cheaper contractor, and now workers were in the hospital because of equipment failure. "I'm heading to the site now," I told David. "Meet me there in 20 minutes." The construction site was chaos when I arrived. Paramedics were loading the last injured worker into an ambulance while police officers took statements from witnesses. The collapsed scaffolding lay twisted on the ground like a broken skeleton, surrounded by scattered tools and safety equipment. "Mr. Flores." A woman in a hard hat and clipboard approached me. "I'm Inspector Williams from OSHA. I'll need to speak with you about the safety protocols for this site." Over the next hour, I learned more about construction site safety than I'd ever wanted to know. The scaffolding that had collapsed was supposed to support workers installing exterior panels on the building's third floor. According to witnesses, it had given way, suddenly sending 3 men falling 20 feet to the concrete below. The preliminary assessment suggests the scaffolding wasn't properly assembled, Inspector Williams explained. Some of the connecting joints appear to have been undersized for the load they were supporting. What does that mean for the workers who were injured? That depends on the severity of their injuries and the investigation results. But if we determine there were safety violations, there could be serious legal and financial consequences for your company. David and I spent the rest of the day dealing with the crisis, talking to lawyers, coordinating with insurance companies, visiting the injured workers at the hospital. The most seriously hurt was a young man named Miguel Santos, who had suffered a broken back and was facing months of rehabilitation. He has 2 little kids, his wife Carmen told me as we sat in the hospital waiting room. He's been working construction for 10 years, always been careful about safety. This shouldn't have happened. I found myself thinking about Richard Blackstone's advice about pragmatic business decisions. The choice to use a cheaper scaffolding contractor had probably seemed like smart business at the time, a way to improve profit margins on a competitive project. But now a young father was lying in a hospital bed, and his family was facing financial ruin. Mrs. Santos, I said, I want you to know that Chen Industries will cover all of Miguel's medical expenses, including rehabilitation, and will continue his salary until he's able to return to work. Carmen looked at me with surprise. You will? Even though he doesn't work directly for your company. He was injured on our project. That makes him our responsibility. David pulled me aside after we left the hospital. Jerry, I understand the impulse to help, but legally we're not obligated to cover Miguel's expenses. Our insurance will handle the basic workers' compensation, and the scaffolding company is ultimately liable for their equipment failure. I don't care about the legal obligations. I care about doing what's right. What's right could end up costing us hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe more. And it could set a precedent that affects how we handle every future incident. I thought about Richard Blackstone's warnings about letting sentiment override business judgment. I thought about Brianna's pragmatic approach to difficult decisions. I thought about Dustin's shame over the human costs of business-first thinking. David, what would have happened if we'd continued using our original scaffolding contractor? They would have charged more, which would have reduced our profit margin on the project. But Miguel Santos would be at home with his family right now instead of lying in a hospital bed. David was quiet for a moment. Probably yes. Then the choice is clear. We cover his expenses, we make sure his family is taken care of, and we go back to using contractors based on quality and safety record instead of just cost. That evening, I called an emergency meeting of Chen Industries' senior management team. Word of the accident had spread through the company, and everyone was shaken by what had happened. These were people who'd worked in construction and development for years, who understood that job sites could be dangerous even under the best circumstances. I want to review every contractor and subcontractor we're currently using, I told the assembled group. If we're working with anyone primarily because they submitted the lowest bid, I want to know about it. Margaret Walsh raised her hand. Mr. Flores, that could be a significant number of contracts. The pressure to control costs has been intense over the past few years. Then we need to change our priorities. I'd rather have smaller profit margins and know that everyone working on our projects goes home safe at the end of the day. Robert Chen, the head of construction operations, looked uncomfortable. Sir, that's going to put us at a competitive disadvantage. Other developers are going to undercut our bids if we're using more expensive contractors. Let them. We'll compete by delivering higher quality projects with better safety records. There have to be clients who value those things more than just getting the lowest possible price. Over the next 2 hours, we identified 17 different contractors and subcontractors who had been selected primarily on cost rather than quality. Switching to more expensive alternatives would increase our operating costs by roughly 8% across all active projects. That's going to have a significant impact on profitability, David warned after most of the team had left. Good. Maybe we've been too profitable. Maybe some of those profits should have been going to worker safety and community impact all along. The next few weeks tested my resolve in ways I hadn't anticipated. Word of our policy changes spread through the industry and reactions were mixed. Some potential clients were interested in working with a development company that prioritized safety and community impact. Others went with competitors who could offer lower bids because they weren't spending money on what they considered unnecessary safeguards. Richard Blackstone called several times, each conversation becoming more direct about his concerns regarding my management approach. Jerry, I'm hearing troubling things about the direction you're taking the company, he said during one particularly tense phone call. Expensive safety protocols, extended project timelines, above market wages for workers. These aren't sustainable business practices. They're sustainable if we adjust our expectations about profit margins. Profit margins aren't just numbers on a balance sheet. They're what allow us to invest in new projects, to hire more workers, to grow the business. If you squeeze them too tight, you'll end up with a company that can't compete and can't create jobs. I knew he had a point, but I also knew that I couldn't go back to making decisions based purely on financial considerations. Richard, what if we're competing in the wrong arena? What if instead of trying to be the cheapest option, we become known as the most ethical and reliable option? That's a nice theory, but it assumes there are enough clients willing to pay premium prices for ethical business practices. In my experience, most people make decisions based on cost and schedule, not corporate values. The real test came 6 weeks after the scaffolding accident, when we submitted bids for 3 major projects. Our proposals were significantly higher than our competitors' bids because of our new safety protocols and contractor standards. We lost all 3 contracts. This is what I was afraid of, David said as we reviewed the rejection letters in my office. We're pricing ourselves out of the market. I stared out the window at the city skyline, wondering if I was destroying the company that Brianna had spent 15 years building. Maybe Richard Blackstone was right. Maybe noble intentions weren't enough to sustain a business in a competitive marketplace. But then Margaret Walsh knocked on my door with news that changed my perspective entirely. Mr. Flores, I just got off the phone with Dr. Elizabeth Morrison from Metropolitan Health Systems. They want to meet with us about their new medical campus project. Metropolitan Health Systems was one of the largest healthcare organizations in the region, with a reputation for innovative medical care and community outreach. Their new medical campus would be a massive project worth over $60 million. What did Dr. Morrison say? She said they'd heard about our approach to the South Side development and the changes we made after the construction accident. They want to work with a developer who shares their values about community impact and worker safety. The meeting with Metropolitan Health Systems took place the following week, and it was unlike any business meeting I'd ever attended. Instead of focusing primarily on cost and timeline, Dr. Morrison and her team asked detailed questions about our safety protocols, our relationships with community organizations, and our approach to minimizing construction impact on nearby neighborhoods. We're not just building a medical facility, Dr. Morrison explained. We're trying to create a healthcare campus that serves as a model for responsible development. We want partners who understand that the cheapest option isn't always the best option. By the end of the meeting, we had a preliminary agreement for a project that would generate more profit than the 3 contracts we'd lost the previous month, even with our higher operating costs. You know what's interesting, David said as we drove back to the office. Dr. Morrison mentioned that they'd worked with other developers in the past who cut corners on safety and community impact. She said those projects always ended up costing more in the long run because of delays, accidents, and community opposition. So maybe ethical business practices aren't just morally right. Maybe they're also smart business. Maybe they are, at least with the right clients. That evening, I called Dustin to share the news about the Metropolitan Health Systems contract. He'd been following the company's changes closely, partly out of family concern, and partly because he was documenting our experience as a case study for his urban planning classes. "Dad, I have to tell you something," he said after I'd described the meeting. "I've been skeptical about whether your approach could really work in today's business environment, but this contract proves something important." "What's that?" "There are clients who value ethical business practices, but they're not necessarily the ones who make decisions based purely on cost. They're the ones who think long-term, who understand that sustainable success requires sustainable practices. Your mother built relationships with clients like that too. Maybe I just need to focus on finding more of them." Maybe that's exactly what Chen Industries needs to become the developer that ethical organizations choose when they want to do projects the right way. As I hung up the phone, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in how I thought about business and success. I was no longer trying to prove that I could run Brianna's company according to her methods. Instead, I was building something new, a company that honored her memory while reflecting the values she'd rediscovered in her final months. The road ahead would still be challenging. There would be more decisions that pitted financial interests against human concerns, more competitors who could undercut our prices by cutting corners we weren't willing to cut. But for the first time since inheriting Chen Industries, I felt confident that we were heading in the right direction. The Miguel Santos situation had been resolved with his full recovery and return to work, but it had taught me an important lesson about the true cost of business decisions. Every choice we made as a company affected real people with real lives, and taking responsibility for those effects wasn't just morally necessary. It was what distinguished us from competitors who saw workers and community members as abstractions rather than human beings. That night, I sat in my apartment reading through the files Patricia Hawkins had prepared for the next day's training session. But my mind kept returning to Brianna's letter and her challenge to show our son what real success looks like. Maybe real success wasn't about building the biggest company or generating the highest profits. Maybe it was about building something sustainable and ethical, something that made the community stronger, rather than just making the owners wealthier. For the first time since the will reading, I felt like I was beginning to understand what Brianna had been trying to give me. Not just money and power, but the opportunity to prove that business could be a force for good in the world, if it was guided by the right principles and the right people. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but by the 6-month anniversary of Brianna's death, Chen Industries had evolved into something neither of us could have imagined when we first fell in love 24 years ago. The Metropolitan Health Systems contract had opened doors to other clients who valued ethical business practices, and we'd built a reputation as the developers who did things the right way, even when the right way was more expensive. But success brought its own challenges. Richard Blackstone had grown increasingly vocal in his opposition to my management approach, and I'd started hearing rumors that he was organizing other investors to challenge my leadership of the company. The confrontation came on a gray October morning when Richard arrived at my office unannounced, flanked by 2 other men I recognized as major investors in Chen Industries. David had tried to intercept them in the lobby, but Richard had insisted on speaking with me directly. "Jerry, we need to talk," Richard said as he settled into one of the chairs across from my desk. "This is Thomas Wellington and Marcus Reed, both significant stakeholders in the company. We're here because we're concerned about the direction Chen Industries is heading." I'd been expecting this conversation for weeks, but that didn't make it any less intimidating. These 3 men controlled enough investment capital to make my life very difficult if they decided I wasn't fit to run the company. "What specifically concerns you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Thomas Wellington, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and the bearing of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room, pulled out a folder thick with financial documents. "Your operating costs have increased by 12% over the past 6 months, while profit margins have declined by 8%. You're spending money on safety protocols and community outreach that have no measurable return on investment. The Metropolitan Health Systems contract alone generated more profit than we lost on those operating cost increases." "One contract," Marcus Reed interjected. He was younger than the other 2, probably in his early 40s, with the kind of aggressive energy that suggested he was used to getting his way through sheer force of personality. "One contract doesn't establish a sustainable business model. You can't run a company based on finding clients who are willing to overpay for feel-good policies." Richard leaned forward, his expression serious but not unkind. "Jerry, I understand what you're trying to do, and I respect the impulse. But business isn't charity work. You have responsibilities to employees, investors, and stakeholders that go beyond making yourself feel better about corporate ethics. Those same employees are the ones benefiting from improved safety protocols and better working conditions. And they'll all be out of work if the company becomes uncompetitive," Thomas said sharply. "Good intentions don't pay salaries or fund pension plans." We argued for over an hour with each side presenting facts and figures to support their position. They showed me market analyses demonstrating how our competitors were winning contracts with lower bids. I showed them client feedback praising our approach, and expressing interest in future projects. The bottom line, Richard finally said, is that we have the voting power to call a board meeting and potentially replace you as CEO. We don't want to do that. It would be disruptive and potentially damaging to the company's reputation. But we will, if necessary. The threat hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. What are you proposing, Cho? Scale back the expensive safety protocols to industry standards. Return to competitive bidding processes that prioritize cost over idealistic considerations. Focus on profitability instead of public relations. Marcus's tone suggested these weren't negotiable requests. Give us 6 months of traditional business practices and we'll reassess your leadership based on financial performance. After they left, I sat alone in my office, staring out at the city that had become my responsibility in ways I'd never anticipated. Everything I'd tried to build over the past 6 months was being threatened by the same financial pressures that had shaped Brianna's evolution from idealistic young lawyer to pragmatic business executive. David knocked on my door an hour later, his expression grim. I heard about the meeting with Blackstone and the others. Margaret told me they were pretty direct about their concerns. They want me to abandon everything we've changed and go back to Brianna's old way of doing business. And if you don't, they'll call a board meeting and try to have me replaced as CEO. David sat down heavily in one of the chairs the investors had vacated. Jerry, I have to ask, do you think they're wrong about the financial risks? I mean, it was a fair question and one I'd been wrestling with since the meeting ended. Honestly, I don't know. Maybe they're right that we can't sustain this approach long term. Maybe I'm being naive about how business really works. Or maybe you're just ahead of the curve. The Metropolitan Health System's contract proves there are clients who value what we're offering. The question is whether there are enough of them to support a sustainable business model. That evening, I drove to the Southside development site, where my journey into corporate leadership had really begun. The old apartment buildings had been demolished, and construction was well underway on the new mixed-use complex. The project was 2 weeks ahead of schedule and under budget, partly because the extended relocation timeline had eliminated most of the community opposition that typically plagued urban development projects. I parked across the street and watched the construction workers securing scaffolding for the next day's work. Every safety protocol was being followed precisely, every piece of equipment was properly inspected, and every worker was wearing the required protective gear. It was costing us more money than the old approach, but no one had been injured on any Chen Industries project since we'd implemented the new standards. Rosa Martinez appeared beside my car carrying groceries from the small market that had opened in one of the completed retail spaces. She recognized me through the window and smiled, tapping on the glass. Mr. Flores, I didn't expect to see you here. I rolled down the window. Just checking on the progress. How are you settling into your new place? Very well, thank you. The extra time you gave us made all the difference. My kids were able to finish the school year, and we found a really nice apartment only 10 minutes from here. She gestured toward the construction site. And I have to say, this is going to be beautiful when it's finished. The community is excited about having new retail spaces and the affordable housing units you included in the design. The affordable housing units had been another expensive decision that had drawn criticism from investors. We designated 15% of the residential units for low-income families, which reduced the project's overall profitability, but ensured that some of the original community members could afford to return to the neighborhood. Rosa, can I ask you something? When you first heard about this development project, how did you feel about Chen Industries? She considered the question carefully. Honestly, we were angry and scared. Just another big company coming in to push out the poor people and build something we couldn't afford. But the way you handled everything, listening to our concerns, giving us time to relocate, including affordable units in the new development, it changed how we think about development in our community. What do you mean? We're not against progress, Mr. Flores. We want good things for our neighborhood, but we want to be included in that progress, not pushed out by it. When companies show they care about the people who already live here, we become partners instead of obstacles. After Rosa left, I sat in my car, thinking about partnerships and obstacles, about the different ways businesses could relate to the communities they operated in. The investors who'd confronted me that morning saw community concerns as obstacles to profitability. But what if they were actually opportunities for sustainable growth? My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Dustin, and he sounded excited in a way I hadn't heard since before the will reading. Dad, I have news. Remember that community advocacy work I've been doing? I just got offered a position with the Regional Planning Commission. It's a real job with actual responsibilities and everything. That's wonderful, son. Tell me about it. They want me to head up a new initiative focused on inclusive development, working with private developers and community organizations to create projects that benefit existing residents instead of displacing them. Basically, they want me to help other companies figure out how to do what you've been doing with Chen Industries. The irony wasn't lost on me. Dustin had been displaced from the business empire he'd expected to inherit, but he'd found a new path that aligned with the values Brianna had rediscovered in her final months. I'm proud of you, I said, meaning it completely. There's something else, Dad. The Commission is looking for private sector partners for this initiative, companies that have demonstrated a commitment to ethical development practices. Chen Industries would be perfect. That sounds like it could create some interesting opportunities. It could also help address the concerns your investors have been raising. If Chen Industries becomes the go-to developer for public-private partnerships focused on inclusive development, you'd have a steady stream of projects that value your approach over just low cost. After we hung up, I realized that Dustin had identified something important. Instead of trying to compete with developers who cut corners and minimized costs, we could position Chen Industries as specialists in a growing niche market. There were government agencies, nonprofit organizations, healthcare systems, educational institutions, and socially conscious businesses that needed development partners who shared their values. The next morning, I called a meeting of Chen Industries' senior management team to discuss a strategic pivot. Instead of trying to be everything to everyone, we would focus on becoming the premier developer for clients who prioritized community impact, worker safety, and sustainable business practices. It's a smaller market, David acknowledged as we worked through the implications. But it's also a less crowded market. We could charge premium prices because we'd be offering something our competitors can't match. Margaret Walsh raised her hand. What about the investors? Will they accept a strategy that deliberately limits our potential client base? They'll accept it if it's profitable, I said. And I think it can be more profitable than trying to compete in a race to the bottom with developers who are willing to cut any corner to reduce costs. Over the next 2 weeks, we developed a comprehensive business plan for Chen Industries' evolution into what we called values-based development. Instead of bidding on every available project, we would focus on clients whose priorities aligned with our capabilities. We would market ourselves not as the cheapest option, but as the most reliable, ethical, and community-focused option. The plan included partnerships with organizations like Dustin's Regional Planning Commission, expanded relationships with healthcare systems and educational institutions, and a new division focused specifically on affordable housing development. The financial projections showed that while we would take on fewer projects overall, the profit margins on those projects would be significantly higher. Richard Blackstone was skeptical when I presented the plan to him and the other investors, but he agreed to give it 6 months before calling a board meeting to reassess my leadership. You're betting the company's future on the assumption that there are enough clients who care more about ethics than economics, he said. I hope you're right, because if you're wrong, we'll all pay the price. The real test came 3 weeks later when the city announced a major redevelopment project in the downtown area. It was exactly the kind of high-profile, big-budget project that every major developer in the region would bid on. Under the old approach, Chen Industries would have submitted a competitive bid focused primarily on cost and timeline. Instead, we submitted a proposal that emphasized community engagement, worker safety, environmental sustainability, and inclusive design. Our bid was 15% higher than the lowest proposal, but it included detailed plans for community input, local hiring preferences, and affordable retail spaces for existing small businesses. We probably won't get it, David said as we waited for the city's decision. 15% is a significant premium, and municipal contracts usually go to the lowest qualified bidder. But I'd learned something important from the Metropolitan Health Systems contract and the South Side development. Not all clients made decisions based purely on cost. Some clients were willing to pay more for better outcomes. The call came on a Friday afternoon. The City Council had voted to award the contract to Chen Industries, citing our comprehensive approach to community engagement and our track record of completing projects without safety incidents or significant community opposition. They said something interesting. The city development director told me during our conversation. They said that while our bid was higher up front, they expected it would actually cost less in the long run because we were less likely to face delays from community opposition or safety issues. That weekend, I invited Dustin to join me for dinner at a small restaurant near his new office. He'd been working at the Regional Planning Commission for 2 weeks, and the energy and purpose he'd found in his new role was obvious from the moment he walked in. "Dad, I have to tell you something," he said after we'd ordered. "I understand now why Mom changed her will." "What do you mean?" "I've been working with communities that have been displaced by development projects, and I've seen what happens when companies prioritize profits over people. The damage isn't just financial, it's social, cultural, psychological. Whole communities get scattered to the wind because some developer saved money by cutting corners on relocation assistance." Dustin paused to sip his drink. "But I've also seen what happens when development is done right, when companies like Chen Industries take the time to understand and address community concerns. Those projects create stronger neighborhoods instead of just more expensive ones. Your mother spent years believing that business success required a different set of priorities. Maybe she was wrong, or maybe she was right for her time, but times are changing. There are more clients now who understand that sustainable success requires sustainable practices." As if to prove his point, my phone buzzed with a text message from David. 2 more major clients had contacted Chen Industries about potential projects: a university planning a new campus expansion and a nonprofit organization developing transitional housing for homeless families. Both had specifically mentioned our reputation for ethical development practices. "The irony is," Dustin continued, "I probably would have run the company into the ground if I'd inherited it. I was so focused on maximizing profits and impressing investors that I never stopped to think about whether we were actually creating value for anyone besides shareholders. And now I get to help other people avoid the mistakes I would have made. The Planning Commission is developing guidelines for inclusive development that will help communities negotiate better terms with private developers. It's not about stopping development, it's about making sure development benefits everyone, not just the people with money." After dinner, we walked through downtown past several buildings that Chen Industries had developed over the years. Some were from Brianna's era when the company focused primarily on maximizing square footage and minimizing costs. Others were more recent projects that reflected our new approach with features like public gathering spaces, local art installations, and small business opportunities for community entrepreneurs. "You know what's funny?" Dustin said as we stopped in front of the South Side development site, where construction was nearing completion. "I spent years thinking success meant building bigger, more impressive projects. But this might be the most successful thing Chen Industries has ever done, and it's not because it's the biggest or the most profitable." "Why do you think it's successful?" "Because it made the community stronger instead of weaker, because it created opportunities for people who were already here instead of just displacing them, because it proves that development can be a force for good if it's done with the right intentions." The following Monday brought news that changed everything. Richard Blackstone called to request a meeting, but his tone was different from our previous conversations, less confrontational, more curious. "Jerry, I've been following the response to the downtown redevelopment contract," he said when he arrived at my office. "I've also been looking at the financial projections for the new business model you've implemented." I braced myself for another lecture about the importance of maintaining competitive cost structures. "I owe you an apology," he said, surprising me completely. "When you started making changes to how the company operated, I was certain you were going to run it into the ground. But the numbers don't lie. Chen Industries is more profitable now than it's been in 3 years. The profit margins are smaller on individual projects," I said carefully, "but the projects are more profitable overall because you're charging premium prices for premium services. And more importantly, you're building a brand reputation that attracts high-value clients." Richard smiled for the first time since I'd known him. "I hate to admit this, but you've found something I missed, a market niche that values quality and ethics over just low cost." "Does this mean you're withdrawing your objections to my leadership?" "It means I'm investing more money in the company. If Chen Industries is going to become the premier values-based developer in the region, we should have the capital to take advantage of that opportunity." The conversation continued for another hour, with Richard asking detailed questions about our strategic plans and offering suggestions based on his decades of experience in the industry. It was a completely different dynamic from our previous interactions, focused on collaboration rather than confrontation. "There's one more thing," Richard said as he prepared to leave. "I knew Brianna for 15 years, watched her build this company from nothing. Toward the end, she started asking me questions about whether we were building things that made the world better or just made us richer. I thought it was just the illness talking, but maybe she was seeing something the rest of us missed." After he left, I sat alone in my office thinking about the journey that had brought me to this point. 9 months ago, I'd been a power plant worker with no expectation of anything beyond a modest retirement and the satisfaction of work well done. Now I was running a multi-million-dollar company that employed hundreds of people and shaped communities across the region. But the most important change wasn't in my circumstances, it was in my understanding of what success really meant. Brianna had built Chen Industries by learning to prioritize financial outcomes over human considerations. In her final months, she'd realized that approach had cost her more than she'd gained. Now I was trying to prove that business success and ethical behavior weren't mutually exclusive, that treating people with dignity and respect wasn't just morally right, but also economically smart. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Margaret Walsh, and her voice was filled with excitement. "Mr. Flores, I just got off the phone with the director of the State Housing Authority. They want to discuss a partnership with Chen Industries to develop affordable housing across 3 counties. It would be the largest affordable housing initiative in the state's history." That evening, I drove home through neighborhoods that had become familiar over the past months. Communities where Chen Industries had completed projects, where families like Rosa Martinez had found ways to thrive despite the challenges of urban development. The sunset painted the city in warm colors that made even the most modest buildings look beautiful, and I found myself thinking about legacy and the different ways people measured a life well lived. Brianna had achieved everything she'd set out to achieve in terms of wealth and business success, but in her final letter, she'd made it clear that those achievements hadn't brought her the happiness she'd been seeking. Maybe the real measure of success wasn't how much money you accumulated or how many impressive buildings bore your company's name. Maybe it was about the people whose lives were better because of the choices you made and the values you upheld. As I pulled into my apartment complex parking lot, I realized that for the first time in years, I was genuinely excited about going to work the next day. There would be new challenges, new decisions that tested the balance between idealism and pragmatism, new opportunities to prove that business could be a force for good in the world. But tonight, I was just Jerry Flores, a guy who'd been given a second chance to build something meaningful with his life. The power plant worker who'd inherited an empire had become something neither he nor Brianna could have imagined, a leader who understood that true success meant using whatever power you had to make the world a little bit better for the people who came after you. In my apartment, I found Brianna's letter tucked into the frame of that old photograph from the power plant picnic. Her final words to me had become a daily reminder of the trust she'd placed in my hands and the responsibility that came with it. Tomorrow would bring new decisions, new opportunities to honor that trust or betray it. But for now, it was enough to know that I'd found a path that led somewhere worth going, a way to build success that didn't require abandoning the values that had shaped me long before I'd ever heard of Chen Industries, or imagined myself in a corporate boardroom. The transformation was complete, but the real work was just beginning.